After a lot of prep work, it is finally time to glue the upper and lower section of the forward superstructure together. Once glued together, I then need to do some patching to blend those two parts into each other and get rid of the unsightly joint lines. First, I'm going to install these wing structures. I want to do them first because there's a joint that I want to sand and fill. I don't like these little notches sticking out here by the edge of the platform and just above the wriggle of that porthole. I want that to be a smooth surface and not have that visible. And there's a similar notch at the aft of these structures. So while holding the part in place on the ship, I apply extra thin super glue to the edges to bond them in place. After giving these parts around an hour to dry, I can then move on to the filling and sanding phase. To fill, I'm using Tamiya plastic putty that I apply to the joints with a toothpick. I do not need to put on a lot of putty, I just need to fill that gap. So I just gently push it in and try to remove as much of the excess as I can. The more excess I can remove at this stage, the less I have to sand off at a later stage. Once all the gaps around these notches are filled, I then need to wait for the putty to dry. That's around another hour of drying time. After the putty has finally dried, I can then sand it smooth. To protect edges and details, I cover them with masking tape. This allows me to sand over the detail without worrying about removing it. The sanding pressure that I'm using is very light, it just needs to be enough to remove the putty and not eat into the plastic. After going back and forth with sanding and applying tape, in some cases even applying additional putty because I didn't put enough on, I have the surface in a shape that I'm happy with. Since this area of the ship will be difficult to access once the upper section of the superstructure is glued to the lower section, I need to ensure that this patchwork has been successful and does not need further correction. So in order to reveal any defects in this area, I spray the area with Mr. Surfacer 500. That will both fill micro scratches and also reveal any larger defects that it is unable to cope with. And indeed, there are some defects that I'm not entirely happy with, so after another round of patching and sanding, I then respray the area Mr. Surfacer 500, and I'm happy with the finish. This means that the upper section is now ready to be glued to the lower section. Well, almost. Before I do that, I need to install these hut structures. Since this is photo etch, plastic cement will not be effective, so I apply extra thick super glue to the deck around this raised area and then place the hut structures over the glue. After gluing down these huts, well, okay, I call them huts, but they're not huts. I think they're some kind of large vent. There's no doors to get into them, and it has this grating on them, so they're not huts. They're probably some variety of vent, but I call them huts. Please excuse me. Anyways, in addition to those things, there's this square section of bulkhead that gets placed between the upper and lower sections that I'm gluing together. Since it's positioned based on its location on the deck and not on the ceiling, I need to glue it to the deck first, and then wherever the upper portion of this superstructure lands on the top of that structure will be the correct place. If I did it the other way around, I could run into trouble, because if I didn't get the positioning correct on the bottom of the upper deck, then it wouldn't align with the plastic ridge on the deck below, and then it wouldn't fit together. So it needs to be done this way. To glue it down, I place it over the molded outcropping on the deck, and then apply extra thin plastic cement to the inside of the component. And now for what we've all been waiting for the last several videos. The upper section of the superstructure will be glued to the lower section. To glue that together, first I'll apply Revell Contactor Professional to the top of this square structure, and then I will place the upper portion onto the lower portion. Since I'm able to access down these structures on the wings all the way to the deck where the contact point is, I'm able to apply the glue from the inside. That is advantageous because applying the glue from the inside will not harm the paint on the outside. It's just one less thing to worry about or attempt to correct. For the contact areas at the front of these structures, that's a different story. There's no ways I can apply it from the inside, and in reality it doesn't matter all that much because there are joints here that are going to have to be corrected. So it is going to require filling and sanding, which means that area is going to have to be repainted anyway. So I'm actually not concerned about preserving the paint in this area. So I apply extra thin plastic cement to the joint line from the exterior. The section of bulkhead directly underneath the AA platforms floats very slightly above the lower section of the superstructure, so it needs a bit of help to get it into place. If the gap was any bigger, I would fill the gap, but the gap is small enough such that if I just push it down and then apply extra thin superglue to the seam line, it will firmly bond in place. And while I am pushing it down, visually it's unnoticeable. So it's easier to fix it like this rather than trying to fill and sand. And that's just unnecessary. Only go through the effort of doing that if it's something that you're going to notice. In this case, it's not. So after reinforcing all the edges with superglue or extra thin plastic cement, whatever is most appropriate for those joint lines, I then leave this area of the superstructure to dry for a good long time, because next up is some more aggressive filling and sanding. What I suspect is going to be the most difficult area of the superstructure to correct is going to be this joint line at the front of the conning tower. There is supposed to be a second step here, and with all of the sanding and shaping that I've been doing, that has resulted in a bit of a curved edge, and I've lost that nice crisp line. So I'm going to have to reconstruct that. As for the joint lines on the sides, that I did prepare for, so it shouldn't be too difficult to fill that. I don't need to cut back on any of the plastic, I'd already done that. So all I really need to do there is just fill the gap and then sand it smooth. I am able to fairly easily access that area with a file, so that shouldn't be too much of a problem. I just need to be careful not to damage the photo etch in the area or the fine details like the wriggles over the portholes. I mask off those areas to protect them from the filler and then apply thinned filler. I've thinned the putty using Tamiya lacquer thinners. Lacquer thinners will dissolve the putty, but it will not harm the plastic. You can also use lacquer thinners to remove excess if you need to. I then apply the thin putty using a toothpick to the areas where I need to bulk up that plastic. After giving the putty around an hour to dry, it can be sanded. I'm going to start with the easier sections. That's this bit on the side here. A 400 grit sandpaper does the job and smooths off that surface quite easily. Since this is a flat area without any obstructions, it's quite easy to sand in this place, so it goes off without a hitch. As I said, the part that concerns me is that curved section of the conning tower. Anyways, that's a problem for a little bit later. After completing the port side of the superstructure, and then move on to the starboard side and repeat the process. It was successful on the port side, so I don't see it going any worse on the starboard side. And as expected, it went well. Consider how difficult it would have been to make all of these modifications and do all of this filling and sanding if this superstructure was already glued to the hull. It would be so unwieldy and so difficult to get into there. This is why you don't follow the instruction manual. If you follow the instruction manual, it will show you literally how you can put the parts on top of each other. It doesn't show you how you can build the ship. Certainly doesn't show you how you can build the ship while eliminating joint lines and those sort of things. If you want a ship, follow the instructions. If you want a ship that looks good, you're going to have to make modifications to what the instructions say. And you're certainly going to have to do things in a different order. Now's the time to deal with this section at the front. The most important thing at this stage, I think, is to protect the upper section. I don't want to remove any plastic from that area. So I'm going to start by putting additional tape to protect the upper level, and then I'm going to sand off as much of the excess as I can. This is quite tedious and it's not working quite as well as I'd hoped. What I'm really doing, instead of creating a nice step over here, is actually creating a curve, which I suppose is to be expected because this is a sponge. It's not a piece of metal, so it can't cut a straight edge into this putty. So I'm going to have to think about doing this in a different way. I suspect a file is going to be coming out in the near future. But let me see what I've got at the moment. Let me spray all of this with a surfacer just so I can see how this all looks. I'm very happy with how it looks at the side. I'm not happy with the curved section at the front underneath the conning tower. That is going to need to be fixed. I'm not going to show it because it is very tedious and quite boring, but it's a matter of putting a length of masking tape along that edge, applying some putty, sanding, removing the tape on the edge. I keep on doing that backwards and forwards until I get that step in there that should be there. Now that I've finally got it into a condition that I'm happy with, this area of the ship can be painted. Since all of these areas that I've been working on are painted in XF53, provided I'm careful to spray at the correct angle, I don't need to mask. However, that wing structure, I did make some further corrections to it, and it does need to be repainted as well. And since I need to spray down in that area, I will have to mask off at least that area of the structure. Once that's done, it's a simple matter of spraying these components, and that will reveal the final effect of gluing all of these components together. Hopefully it will be good. Initial observations are very positive. I'm quite liking how this is looking. Definitely got that step in there quite nicely at the front of the conning tower, and these joint lines on the sides of the superstructure have been blended in very nicely. The paint is applied, they all but disappear. I don't mind there being slight lines. I mean, it seems like a natural thing. Do expect there to be slight variation on the plating of a ship. It doesn't necessarily have to be perfectly smooth. That doesn't overly concern me, and it is very subtle. The thing that you need to remember at this stage of construction, there's not a lot for you to look at. This is a small area of the ship with no details on it. You have to really stop and inspect to notice those kind of things, and also consider there's going to be weathering on top of that. And there it is, one piece of forward superstructure. This entire section can now be glued onto the ship. There are only two small areas that then need to be filled and sanded. At the base here, where this lower section of bulkhead connects to the base of the shelter deck. Once that's in place, I can then continue to move upwards in this area of the superstructure. All the upper levels connect on the top of the structure over here in such a way that I do not have to sand or fill any gaps. In the next video, that's what I'll do. I'll glue this to the deck and then plan the next section going upwards on this area of the superstructure. If you would like to support this channel or see how the ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.